Hi, everybody. So yes, I'm here to talk to you today about documentation, because that's all I talk about to anyone ever. But in particular, about the maintenance of that documentation over the long term. So first, just a smidgen about me. Hi, I'm Kenzie. And I was trying to figure out what I should even put on this slide, because my job has been shifting a lot lately. And also we're going through this massive project. And so what do I actually do? I attend meetings, a lot of meetings. But when I'm trying to make myself feel better about what I actually do, I say I contribute substantively in meetings, which also doesn't actually help. One of the things I do in meetings, because I, like many of us maybe, have attention deficit disorders, I doodle a lot in meetings. So I've been doodling a lot lately because I go to a lot of meetings. I also care about documentation a lot. I talk obsessively about it in meetings. But probably a better description would be, I work at BCIT. I write and edit documentation. I design and deliver user training, and I support and advocate for users a lot. So that's me. The other thing you should know about me, and I know that this is probably obvious, is I am but one person, one strongly opinionated person, and everything that is in this talk is just this one strongly opinionated person's opinion. But I hope it does have some use to you, and I will have missed things. And you'll be thinking, hey, yeah, but, and I invite you to come and talk to me about it afterwards. So, documentation. You know, we all have a dream, right? That documentation will be great. So that is the dream. It's great. But only when it is current, accurate, and relevant. And sometimes it isn't, which is actually the problem. And before I get too far into it, I'm just going to define my terms a little bit. So what is documentation? I know we all probably actually have a different idea in mind. When I'm feeling most put upon of all, I say it's the life-changing magic of actually writing things down, which isn't a very helpful definition maybe. So more broadly, I actually mean a very broad and all-inclusive kind of version of documentation. So when I'm talking about documentation today, I'm talking about developer documentation, user documentation, your knowledge base, which is somehow inexplicably separate from your documentation, which, you know, don't do that. And all the other things, all of it, I'm talking about all of it, all right? So, what is long-term maintenance? Well, it's all of the things that we can do to keep our documentation accurate, relevant, and current over the long term, all right? So, this is the part where I have to tell you something very hard, and I'm you know, it doesn't please me to make you unhappy, so we'll do it as quickly as we can. Technology won't save us. I know that there are probably many of you in this room who are like, but no, I have a great solution, and then you do this, and it's perfect, like the technology will, but it won't, unfortunately. Technological solutions can help. They are very, very important. But when it comes down to maintenance, it still always comes back to people. I'm so sorry, basically. Yep. So here's the plan for what I'm going to talk about. I've already done the introductions and definitions part. I've crushed your hopes and dreams. Okay, good. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just sort of establish what criteria am I going to be using when I'm trying to figure out what is or isn't a good strategy. Like how am I going to evaluate these things? So that will be here. Okay. So in order for something to be a good documentation maintenance strategy, it has to work for the people who are using it. And this might seem very obvious, but I mean, it really has to work for those people, because those are the people. So it can't work for a better version of those people who try harder, because there's no trying harder, and there's no better version. These are the people you have. It has to work for them, okay? It has to do the thing that it's supposed to do. It has to ensure that your documentation remains accurate, relevant, and current over time. That's very obvious, but it certainly, if it doesn't do that, it's not a good strategy. And this actually ties back to the first one as well, is that in order for it to be a good strategy, it has to be self-sustaining. It has to encourage its own use over time, which means that what that means will be different depending on the people that you have, because some people will be more attracted to certain options than others, and so they'll work for that audience when it wouldn't work for a different audience, right? So it should make people want to keep using it, because it pays them an immediate benefit as well as a long-term benefit. It needs to fit all your budgets. right? And those vary too. So it needs to fit the budget of money, can't cost more than you have. It has to fit the time that people have available to do the work. It has to fit in the amount of attention that anyone is willing to pay to the documentation. And it can't impact your performance budget, right? Because it's the documentation, it's in support of the product. It can't supersede the product. So it has to fit all of the budgets. And it should be forward-thinking, and it should be able to scale as needed, right? Because if you have a strategy and it works at the small scale, but it will not work at a large scale, then you have a problem, because by the time you get to a large scale, you just have a mess, right? So those are the criteria I'm going to use. I've made these little icons, and I'm going to sort of mark those down for each of the strategies, so you can look back at it later if you want, because you'll have access to these slides. So we know that. Next, we're going to talk about the strategies themselves, starting with, these are strategies that aren't even maintenance strategies. These are strategies that you can use when you're creating or working on your documentation that will support maintenance over time. So let's talk first, yes, about self-documenting code. Now, as we all know, this is a debate that people have been having on the internet since the internet. And for some reason, I've chosen today to be my day to wade into it. So what is self-documenting code? Well, what it means in its most basic way is that when you are writing your code, you're writing it in a way that is human readable, that lets people can see by your variable naming and your function naming and things like this what everything is intended to do. So it's not just what does variable I actually do here and that sort of thing. Every variable is readable, every function name is readable, and all those sorts of things. There's more to it than that, but that's sort of the basics, right? So, self-documenting code. Well, what are the pros of this approach? Well, it does make your code base more maintainable over time. It's easier for people to go in and look at things and figure out where they work if they can actually just see it without having to, interpret it and follow things around through the code to figure it out. It's more maintainable when you can actually understand what every piece is. Because no one has to go on those safaris, it will save future developer time as well. And in my experience, it inspires a great deal of enthusiasm for the people who are really into their self-documenting code. They love to talk about it and hit everyone else over the head with it, and it's great. So it is self-sustaining in that way. It attracts use. And because all of your so-called documentation, and I'm tipping my hand a little bit, so there you go, is right there in the code, and when you change the code, it's changed. Outdated info will be very unlikely in this system, right? Cons, it's not really a thing though, right? We call it self-documenting code, but it's not actually documentation, even though I said documentation was very inclusive. Okay, so I'm going back on everything that I just said, but it's not documentation that is usable by more than the people who are looking at the code, which is a very small proportion of the people who are using it, likely. And it's not documentation in that, just because you know what a variable is being used for or what a function will supposedly do, that doesn't tell you how it interacts with anything else. It doesn't tell you what the impact will be of changing something here. It doesn't tell you what the intent was. It doesn't tell you all of the things that documentation can tell you, right? So it doesn't have also a big holistic view of what's going on with your documentation overall. It can be hard to identify gaps or duplications, things like that. And of course, it's only available to one audience, as I said. It's inaccessible to end users, and it has limited reusability. So then some of you would be saying, oh, okay, fine. Well, you do that, but you comment things well, right? Which, great, okay. That helps more, and your outdated info is, more unlikely than it was. Again, you still have that problem, and the quality of that can be variable because you're dependent on all the individual humans to follow your commenting standards, even when they're busy and rushed and all those sorts of things. So, I think it's fair to say, for example, here's some code comments, and here's some, clearly labeled functions, and they don't really add anything, right? These comments exist, but they don't add any of that information that I was talking about before. It is good if you can do good code comments, you can write your code well. In fact, let's just call it that. Write good code. That makes it actually easier to maintain documentation over time because it's more readable, more understandable already. So that's that one. Another one would be talking about structured content. What is structured content? Well, it's a way of arranging your content using a big organizational schema that lets you have a lot of reuse of individual parts. You can make a description for a thing, and you could use that in your developer documentation that you output from this, or your user documentation you out from this, or whatever. So that can be very useful. It has a bunch of pros, so duplication and inconsistency are unlikely because you're single sourcing things and reusing things, and that's good. The holistic view of your documentation is sort of built into the schema, right? It's easier to update over time. It scales well because if you have a good schema, the bigger things get, it won't matter too much because you can still just keep working within that organizational system. Cons is, of course, that your documentation tool is likely to be separate from your code base. And when those things are separated, it's a lot harder to maintain them in parallel. And it can be very daunting for inexperienced writers or other folks who are trying to deal with it. But it can be useful. It can be another strategy that can support maintenance over time. Another one, automatic documentation generation. So that's where you have, you're writing your code and you're writing it in such a way that you can run a generator of some kind that will then pull the things that are right with your code into other documents. You can create relational diagrams and all sorts of things sort of automatically. There's all sorts of ways that this works. I am not been actually lucky enough to get to work with one, but there's a lot of things there. So what are the pros? Well, it's so much fun if you're a developer. You will talk about it obsessively to everybody. You'll love it, and you'll talk about how great it is, and no one has to ever update the documentation ever again because you have this great tool. And so it is self-sustaining for those people. It's easy to update because you just regenerate the code when you make changes, right? You just regenerate the documentation. And if you are pulling your code samples directly out of the code, your code samples are likely to actually work, which would be exciting for some kinds of documentation, right? Cons, of course, the quality can be quite variable because it, again, requires people to very, very assiduously do all the right things when they're updating the code. Gaps are inevitable because the kind of things that you're doing in the code will be very specific to the code that you are looking at when you're creating it. So you'll be missing still those, those broader, how do all the things interrelate? What does it all mean? Why? Those kinds of documents. And now you've got one more thing to maintain, right? Your generator, and to make sure that everything is being done right. But it can be useful. It can be another part of it, one piece to the whole thing. Here's another one. Good record keeping. Who knew? Good record keeping is very useful, and it can be any number of things. So where I work at BCIT, our documentation, which we all just for some reason call the knowledge base, I'm not 100% clear why, but that's what we do. It is all managed, it's in a bunch of different places, it's all over the place, but we keep a record of every single thing in our ITSM tool. And so here's, for example, a whole bunch of stuff for software that I maintain, and we have all this documentation. It all has a person who is associated with a content owner. It has a backup content owner in case that person leaves the institute, wins the lottery, what have you. It has a review date. It has a review cycle. It has all sorts of things. I'll come back to those concepts a little bit later. And we keep these records so we know where all the things are. And I just felt, I was amused at the name of this article that I circled, which is zombie pages, which is a thing. Anyway, it's an aside. It's not actually relevant to the talk, but it amused me. So pros to good records, you do have that holistic view because you can see all of your documentation and all the places that it is and so on. It is easier for you to identify your duplications and gaps and those sorts of things, but cons are, well, records are just one more thing to maintain, and record keeping, in my experience, is the easiest thing for people to drop. So the minute things get busy, people will be like, yeah, I'll update that later. It's very easy for people to not want to do it, and it is a thing that tends to reward you more in the long term than in the short term, so it's not as self-sustaining, right? But useful. It can be a strategy that can help and support your maintenance over time. Here's another one. No biggie. Let's just have a dedicated documentation strategist or a documentation team who is integrated with your dev team, right? Like not sitting in a separate building or a separate room or a separate continent or whatever, but interacting with you, participating in your scrums, all those sorts of things. Which also, if you really want to support your long-term maintenance of your documentation, how about we also have the docs environment or processes that are integrated with your dev environment processes and those sorts of things. Pros, well, you're going to have people whose job it is to have that good holistic overall view of the documentation. They'll also be in charge of dealing with gaps, duplications, outdated info, all that sort of thing. And they can support the developers, they can support your user support team, they can support your users. It can be very useful. Also, it takes money, right? And we don't all have all the money that we would like to have. So that can be sort of one of the cons to that. But if you can do it, very useful. So those were strategies around documentation generally. Now I'm going to talk about some strategies that can work pretty well for small scale, small budget things where you have a smaller amount of all the things, including the documentation. So the first one is, well, I said they can work pretty well. This one, I have opinions, you'll see. It's the one where people go, oh, let's go and review all the documentation. It's a content audit, right? So from time to time, some lucky person gets to go and find all the things and look at them. So what's the problem with this? Well, pros first, you do get your good holistic view of the documentation when you do this. It's easy to identify gaps, duplications, outdated content, because you're looking at all of it all at once, right? But it does not scale. It does not scale, it is time-consuming, it is onerous. If you have 20 documents somewhere in the world, it's fine. If you have 600, well, it's never going to happen, right? Because it's going to be interrupted, it's going to be not finished, it's going to be very hard to prioritize. In my experience, everyone loves this until suddenly they don't love this, and it just falls apart on them. I'll come back to talking about how it could still be useful, however, and it can work on the small scale. So that's one. How about this one? This is where we have what's called, I'm going to call it user-triggered reviewer update. This is particularly good for your open source project that you're running off the side of your desk or what have you, where you don't have a ton of resources or you're not going to put a bunch of time into this. You just give your users, the users of your documentation, the opportunity to tell you if there's a problem. So every resource that we have has a little link. You can report a problem with this article, which will go into our records. But you can do this with just an email form, whatever. And the pros to this is you're never going to waste work on maintaining your documentation because you know that you are always updating or reviewing or maintaining a piece of documentation that people are actually using, right? You know they're using it because they looked at it and they told you there was a problem. So it helps to prioritize your efforts when you have a very small budget for time and attention. And it can be cheap or free, right? So that's the good side. The bad side, of course, is you're never going to have that holistic view of all your documentation. It can't identify gaps or duplications for you very well. Maybe it will, but it very rarely will. And it also doesn't really scale. Again, if you have a small little, 15 document piece of documentation that you've written up for your open source thing, that'll work. But if you're, for example, TELUS, and you have 600,000 help documents in your knowledge base, and you're receiving, perhaps 30 or 40 or 50 reports a day, holy cats, that's a pretty onerous thing for someone to have to deal with. So this kind of thing can be very good on the small scale, but it doesn't work as well with a large group, a large pile of stuff. Another one would be, I'm going to call it metrics-directed review. So that's where, for example, you have 15 minutes and you're like, oh, I'll maintain my documentation today because I'm very into my job. So let me pull up the Google Analytics report. Okay, here's my Google Analytics report for our public-facing knowledge base. Well, you can see right away, the page views. There's a lot for a few things, and then it goes pretty significantly down after that. So if we do a little bit of math, so one of these top things is the home page. So if you glance at the home page and review the top 3 resources, you today have reviewed the resources that were needed by 37% of, well, I didn't phrase that correctly, but you know what I mean, like 37% of user attention, you have now addressed the need that they were looking for, right, by reviewing or maintaining that piece of documentation. Another thing that some people do is they look also at the things that are the least viewed, the least looked at, and they just knock a few of those off. They're just gone, or hidden, but sometimes just deleted or archived, because now you don't have to worry about those things getting outdated. They weren't serving a need or a purpose for anyone. They're gone, right? You can also do a thing where you look at what are the most common search terms, and then just check that when you do search for those things, you find the stuff that you were hoping people would find, right? So just a couple little quick checks lets you direct your attention. It helps you prioritize your effort, once again, by user need. It's very, very efficient, and it could be used at any scale. You could do this with any size of documentation repository, but it probably works best and has the biggest impact for small ones. Of course, as a con, if you are doing the part where you delete things, you're deliberately creating gaps, which may not be great. It might be fine, but it also might be a problem. It never gives you that holistic view of all the documentation you have. You can't identify duplications, et cetera. Like, it serves a purpose, but it doesn't serve every purpose, right? All right. So that's sort of small scale stuff. There's two more that I'm going to talk about that I think will work a lot better for people who are trying to maintain documentation on a larger scale, larger budget, admittedly, over a longer period of time for a larger audience with a larger team. This is the bigger one. So the first is what I'm going to call scheduled enforced review. And what do I mean by that? Well, as I said, we have record keeping, and every single resource that has been identified has an owner, and it also has what's called a review cycle. That's a period of time that it must be reviewed. So some things get reviewed every 3 months, every 6 months, every 9 months, every year. Nothing is allowed to be reviewed less frequently than once a year. And when it comes time for people to review it, they will be notified. For us, that means it goes through our ITSM tool. They get assigned a task that they have to deal with, same as every other task that gets assigned to them. And we keep records of that. So right now, I just took a screenshot of this a couple days ago. We have 584 identified resources, and 121 of them are past their review date, which is not ideal. We just went through a big update of the ITSM tool, which stopped sending updates. So we're catching up now, but we'll get back up there. We try and keep it at about 90% reviewed at all times, because people might need a week or two to get to a thing if things are busy, but it's expected that they'll do it. Now, that's the scheduling part. And there, for example, is the task that they'll get assigned is go and review it, tell us if anything needs to be changed, whatever. That's the scheduling part. The enforcement part is also very important. So back in 2011, I was the lucky person who was identified to be our next knowledge base administrator. When they handed it over to me, it had been neglected for 5 years. At the time, there were 600 resources identified in there, which is similar to the number we have now. However, of those 600, only 380 actually existed when I tracked them down. The others were gone, don't know where. In addition, they were about 30% reviewed, which sounds like not the worst until you realize that that 30% were the articles that were owned by me and one colleague, who was nice, and then everything else had not been reviewed in years. So, where does the enforcement piece come in? Well, you can run around begging and pleading, and that doesn't work, actually. But you can also just expect people to do their job and try and enculturate that. And the way that I did that was I would send people a reminder saying, hey, so I know you've got these 7 articles, they haven't been reviewed, can you please take a look at them in the next couple of weeks and let me know what's going on? And they wouldn't do anything. And then about a month later, I would send them a second email at which I'm CCing their manager saying, hey, you still haven't done anything on that. Well, that provoked some resentment, so then I would send another one after another month, and I CC'd the manager and also our CIO. And my friend calls this corporate carpet bombing. Yep. And so the first year, I was unpopular, I admit, but that's okay. I get my self-esteem in other ways. The second year, when I sent out the first email, I got a bit of a response, and the second email, suddenly, I got flooded with people reviewing their things. The third year, I was starting to send out the review emails, and before I had gotten anywhere into it, I started getting people having reviewed their stuff who I hadn't even emailed yet because, oh no, Kenzie's doing the thing again, quick. And then it became a point of pride, right? Like, it became a point of pride for people. It's like, oh, I didn't even get an email. I'm already up to date. Like, it took a bit of enforcement, and it took a bit of being unpopular, but it made it happen. And if you can do that sort of thing, if you have someone who's willing to do that sort of thing, who's resourced to do it, you can make a change, but you can't do it if you don't have that. So the pros to the system is, yes, your outdated documentation will be rare or short-lived because you will identify it within a period of time and get rid of it or update it. You can eliminate gaps and duplications because you can see them. It's not as efficient at eliminating duplication because if you have one person who owns this resource and one person who owns this resource, they may not see both the resources at the same time, but it can help with that. And the workload is manageable over time because no one is ever sitting down and reviewing 600 things. You know, you might get 1 or 2 review notices a week, and you can fit that in, right? So it helps to spread the work out and make it a little more manageable. Of course, cons, it does require a committed resource who's not afraid to not make friends, to support and enforce that review, especially in the beginning. And it is very much reliant on your good records, which if you haven't managed to maintain, can be another problem. So it's got a bunch of dependencies. And this is what we've been using, and it works very well for us. But we have a weird situation around our documentation because we're documenting all kinds of things, not just a single tool or anything like that. So it's an interesting system, and it works for us. It might work for you. I don't know. You can give it a go. The final one I'm going to talk about is the grand unified theory of everything, right? Which just really means it's the grand unified theory of docs maintenance, where you basically combine a whole bunch of these things, right? Because you can have your scheduled and enforced review. You might have to start with doing a content audit. That might be the place you do have to start in the beginning in order to create good records and then move forward from there. But you shouldn't have to do a content audit all the time, but it can be a place to start. And you can do the metrics directed review. You can always have the way for your users to tell you if they see a problem, all of those things, and you just combine as many of them as you can fit in and have the resources for. The advantage to that is that these strategies can reinforce each other and they can reward use, because the more you update things, the fewer emails you'll get telling you that there's problems, and that sort of thing. The variety of all the things will sort of backfill the deficiencies. One thing maybe can't solve all your problems, but another one can solve some of the problems that one can't. And you know, for those of us who love work so much, your Kanban board will never empty. There will always be something you can pick up and do anytime you have a minute to throw at your documentation. And cons, well, hey, complexity. Not all complexity is bad, but you know, complexity is complexity. It adds its own complications. So that's maybe a con. And it's hard to know also how much you can afford and whether you can do all the things. I get that too. All right, so that's all of the sort of strategies that I wanted to talk about. So yeah, I've talked about those. Well, summary and conclusions, and can I restore your optimism and hope for the future? Dunno. But here's my summary. Scale and resources are important when you're considering what to do, but there are plenty of things to choose from, and you should just start now with what and who you have and from where you are. Something is always better than nothing, and then just keep going, and good luck. So there you go. That's... Okay. Yeah. So I can take some questions. I don't know how much time we have, actually.
Enough for a few.
Enough for a few. Okay. Any questions?
I got one.
Okay.
Over here.
Hi.
Hi. I want to say, first of all, your slides are gorgeous.
Thanks. Thanks.
Can we have an open space and show us how you did it?
Sure, if you want.
Awesome.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
So you talked about being unpopular for a little while. I feel like there might be some management like stuff that goes along with that, backing that you got from your manager maybe, or like how did you negotiate that conversation?
Good question. So first of all, I'll just acknowledge first off, I'm unionized. And I actually, here's a bit of politics. You all should be too. Come on. Unionization needs to be a thing in IT, and it's not nearly as much as it should be. So first of all, my job is protected. Second of all, I'm useful in other ways. So I'm not just a one-trick pony, which helps because then that. But managers were actually very much on board. Managers had no idea how to deal with this problem. They had no idea that the problem even existed in some cases. When I made them aware of the problem, they were like, what? There's a thing you were supposed to be doing and you weren't doing it? Go do the thing. And then, so I had no difficulty getting backup and support from them. And I was always very, very polite and friendly because it's not about blame, right? It's just about, hey, could you do the thing that is your job, actually? So, yeah, I'm not sure what more to say about it than that. Yeah.
So, first of all, I just wanted to say, as someone who regularly consumes documentation, thank you for giving a shit about something that most people don't. Thank you. But my question is, we have a lot of kind of disparate sources of documentation. What's your advice on consolidation strategies?
Right. And so we do too. So we have documentation that we write for ourselves internally, which is in Jira and Stash, or it's in our internal social intranet tool in a number of different places. We also have an external-facing knowledge base that is over here. We have an external-facing, internal-facing faculty, one that's in a different place. So how do you tie all these things together? So I made liberal use of email notifications that were directed into our ITSM tool where our records management happens. So everything has an email link, and that email goes to that tool, which automatically puts it into the record for that article, things like that. And so that means that I have articles where, yes, the title of the document is knowledge base article number 1484 dash, and then the actual name of the thing, because when the email notification goes out, it gets put into the thing automatically based on the title. Right. So it's not perfect and it's kludgy, but it was very hard to figure out how to put everything together, right? And you can't put everything together perfectly, but I think you can do a lot if you're not too concerned about it being perfectly pretty. This is the record-keeping part. The record-keeping part needs to be readable by a very small audience, your documentation team or the developers only. It doesn't have to be readable by everyone else. If you can do a lot if you can use the record-keeping piece to tie things together, even if it's ugly, but it still works. Yeah, so, yeah. There's one more up at the back there, or?
Hi, great slides, by the way.
Thanks.
So one of the constraints that people sometimes experience is the budgetary constraint, and I think you touched on performance hits and time hits, which is something that we don't talk about often. Do you have any quick sells in terms
Yes.
of carving time out of the budget if it doesn't exist today?
Good question. I think it comes down to how we count time. So if you do not maintain your documentation, you're probably going to see a hit in your user support. And if we're not tracking that, then we can't make the case that actually we could be saving everybody a bit of time if we put 15 minutes into just checking this thing. Because, yeah. So you can figure out, if you could figure out some way to track using a thing, like when our help desk supports somebody and they can just send people to a resource, they can mark that resource as we just sent someone this resource. They don't have to write everything out. If they do have to write everything out, we make a new resource. But if you can figure out some way to mark that time and tie that time back to the documentation, I think that can be a way to better understand those relationships and find a way to prioritize and carving out the time. Like, it's not going to be perfect, it's political, it's weird, but yeah. Yeah. All right. That's it. Yep. Thank you very much.